Ethan had always prided himself on his garden. It wasn't just a patch of dirt with a few flowers, it was a masterpiece. Every morning, he would step out onto his porch, coffee in hand, and admire the vibrant colors of the tulips, daisies, and violets that he had painstakingly planted and nurtured. The garden was his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the chaos of the world and find peace. But that peace was shattered one fateful morning when he woke up to find his garden in ruins. Petals were scattered across the dirt, stems were broken, and the freshly planted daisies were stomped into the ground as if an elephant had trampled through. Ethan's heart sank as he surveyed the damage. He knew exactly who was responsible. It was Margaret, his neighbor from across the street. Margaret was a middle-aged woman with a permanent scowl etched onto her face. She had a reputation for being difficult, and Ethan had learned to avoid her whenever possible. But this was different. This was an outright invasion of his property. Ethan gripped his coffee mug tighter as he watched Margaret march through his garden, her bare feet crushing the delicate flowers beneath her. She was dressed in her usual morning attire, a flowing robe that swayed with each step, and she seemed completely unbothered by the destruction she was causing. "Morning, Ethan," she called out, stepping directly onto a tulip without even glancing down. Ethan exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "Margaret, you're walking through my garden again." She stopped, turned, and blinked at him as if he had just spoken in an alien language. "Oh, this? It's just a shortcut. It's not a big deal." "Not a big deal," Ethan repeated, his voice rising. "That's what you say every single time." Ethan had spent months perfecting that flower bed. He had spent hours in the sun, carefully selecting the right soil, watering each plant with the precision of a scientist nurturing a rare specimen. And yet, every morning, Margaret treated his garden like her personal sidewalk. He tried reasoning with her. "The sidewalk is literally right there, 2 steps to your left." Margaret scoffed, flipping her hand in the air dismissively. "I've lived here longer than you, sweetie. I've always walked this way. Your little flowers shouldn't be in the way." Ethan gritted his teeth. "They're not in the way. They're planted in my yard, where they belong." But Margaret was already halfway across, trampling over a patch of violets as she strutted toward the mailbox like she owned the entire street. Ethan stared after her, feeling his patience unravel thread by thread. He had been polite. He had asked nicely. He had even installed a tiny fence. Nothing serious, just a decorative border to signal that this was, in fact, not a walkway. Margaret had stepped over it like an Olympic hurdler and kept going without a second thought. Ethan took a deep breath and looked at his yard. His beautiful flowers were a mess again. Enough was enough. That night, Ethan brainstormed solutions with his best friend, Olivia, who lived a few houses down. Olivia was a sharp-witted woman who had zero tolerance for nonsense. She nearly choked on her soda when Ethan told her about Margaret's latest act of floral destruction. "She what?" Olivia sputtered. "She stepped over the fence like a human-sized cockroach?" Ethan sighed, nodding. "Yep, completely unfazed. I even put up little signs." Olivia leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "Okay, but hear me out. What if she couldn't step over it?" Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Olivia grinned. "I mean, make it impossible. What's something no one in their right mind would step on?" Ethan thought for a moment, then it hit him. Cacti. Spiky, unyielding, and perfectly capable of defending themselves. The more he considered it, the better it sounded. If Margaret wanted to act like his yard was a free-for-all, then nature would be the one to stop her. The next day, Ethan went to a nursery and picked out a collection of the most intimidating cacti he could find. He got the tall, towering ones with spines that looked like miniature swords, the short, round ones covered in sharp needles, and even a few that were sneakily disguised as harmless little plants. He spent the entire afternoon planting them right along Margaret's infamous shortcut. They blended in just enough with the remaining flowers, but up close, they were a minefield of pain waiting to happen. As Ethan stepped back to admire his work, he spotted Mr. Harrison, his elderly neighbor, watching from his porch with an amused smirk. "That's a bold move, son, Mr. Harrison chuckled, sipping his iced tea. "You sure she won't just, I don't know, call the police on you for plant aggression?" Ethan grinned. "If she does, I'd love to see that police report. Victim trampled unauthorized cacti while trespassing." That'd hold up real well in court. Mr. Harrison let out a wheezy laugh. Well, this ought to be good. Ethan barely slept that night, anticipation keeping him awake. He imagined it over and over. Margaret, her usual smug stride, her dismissive wave of the hand, and then, bam, the realization, the sharp, unforgiving bite of reality delivered straight to her bare feet. Morning came, and Ethan positioned himself on the porch, coffee in hand, pretending to scroll through his phone. Right on schedule, Margaret appeared, still in her robe, still barefoot, still completely unaware. She marched forward, her expression bored, her pace confident. Then, the second her foot hit the first cactus, the reaction was instant. A piercing scream shattered the peaceful morning air. Margaret leaped back so violently that she nearly toppled over, her arms flailing as she tried to regain balance. Her face contorted in shock and agony as she hopped on one foot, gripping the other, which was now adorned with several tiny spines. "What the?" she shrieked, staring at the ground like it had personally betrayed her. Ethan took a slow, satisfying sip of his coffee. "Morning, Margaret." Her head snapped up, eyes blazing. "What is this?" Ethan feigned confusion, gesturing toward his yard. "My new garden. Beautiful, isn't it?" Margaret's face turned red, and for a moment, Ethan genuinely thought steam might come out of her ears. You did this on purpose." He raised an innocent eyebrow. "Did what? Plant plants in my yard? How terrible of me." Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again, like a fish gasping for air. She looked down at her foot, still covered in cactus needles, then back at Ethan, who continued to sip his coffee with the composure of a man who had just won the greatest battle of his life. Finally, she huffed, turned sharply, and limped away, one shoe still stuck in the cactus patch. Ethan watched her retreat, a victorious smirk forming on his lips. But as he leaned back in his chair, something in Margaret's posture made him pause. She wasn't just angry, she was plotting. Ethan knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Ethan barely had time to savor his victory before Margaret launched her counterattack. The morning after her unfortunate encounter with the cacti, she stormed out of her house, still limping slightly, but with a new level of determination in her scowl. Ethan watched from his porch as she took careful, deliberate steps toward the HOA office at the end of the street. He had seen that march before. It was the same one she used when she complained about people leaving their trash cans out for too long, or when a neighbor dared to paint their shutters a color she deemed unacceptable. This time, Ethan had no doubt who her complaint was about. Sure enough, later that afternoon, an HOA representative named Mr. Grayson showed up at Ethan's doorstep. Mr. Grayson was a grumpy, self-important man with a clipboard permanently attached to his hand. Ethan leaned casually against the door frame, already prepared for the nonsense that was about to spill from Grayson's mouth. "We've received a complaint, Mr. Grayson announced, flipping through his papers as if he were reviewing evidence for a court trial. "It seems you've installed a hazardous obstacle in your yard that is causing safety concerns for the community." Ethan smirked. "You mean my plants?" Mr. Grayson narrowed his eyes. "You planted cacti directly in the path that Miss Margaret has traditionally used." Ethan took a slow sip of his lemonade. "Traditionally used? Since when is my yard part of public property?" Mr. Grayson stiffened. "Miss Margaret claims that she has been walking that way for years, and your recent landscaping choice has resulted in injury. The HOA requires all homeowners to maintain a safe and welcoming environment." Ethan chuckled, crossing his arms. "Oh, I see. So, I'm required to make sure my garden is welcoming to trespassers? Should I also install a red carpet and a juice bar for her convenience?" Mr. Grayson pursed his lips. "That's not what I'm saying." Ethan tilted his head. "So, let me get this straight. I planted legal, natural vegetation in my yard, on my property, and now I'm being told I have to remove it because one person refuses to use the actual sidewalk." Mr. Grayson adjusted his glasses, clearly uncomfortable. "If a plant is deemed hazardous, we have the right to request its removal." Ethan resisted the urge to laugh. "Right. And how many other homeowners on this street have cactus gardens?" Mr. Grayson hesitated, looking down at his clipboard. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "You know what I think? I think Margaret is throwing a tantrum because, for once, she didn't get her way. And now, instead of telling her to stop walking through private property like a normal person, you're trying to punish me for fixing a problem she created. Mr. Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. I understand your frustration, but rules are rules. You have 1 week to remove the cacti, or you'll be fined. Ethan's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to remain calm. He knew the HOA loved handing out fines like candy on Halloween, and he wasn't about to let Margaret win this round. If she wanted to play dirty, so could he. That night, Ethan sat at his desk, flipping through the HOA handbook. He read each section carefully, searching for anything that would give him an edge. After an hour of dry legal jargon, his eyes landed on a specific clause. Decorative rock gardens featuring native desert plants are not only permitted, but encouraged as an eco-friendly landscaping choice. Ethan grinned. He didn't have to remove the cacti. He just had to expand the idea. The next day, Ethan got to work. He ordered bags of decorative gravel, larger drought-resistant plants, and a few strategically placed boulders. He went beyond just cacti, adding agave plants, desert roses, and yucca. He even installed a tasteful wooden sign that read, "Protected Native Garden. Please do not disturb." By the time he was finished, the front yard no longer looked like a simple flower bed. It was a fully realized desert oasis, completely within HOA guidelines. Ethan leaned against his shovel, admiring his handiwork. It was beautiful, functional, and best of all, untouchable by any ridiculous HOA fines. Margaret, of course, was furious. That evening, Ethan caught sight of her peering at his yard from her driveway, arms crossed tightly. He could practically hear her brain overheating as she tried to figure out how to undo what he had done. But she wasn't the type to give up easily. He had humiliated her once, and she was clearly plotting her next move. Ethan didn't have to wait long to see what Margaret's next move would be. Around midnight, he woke up to the sound of rustling outside his window. Peering through the blinds, he spotted a shadowy figure crouching near his cactus garden. He grabbed his phone, flipped on his security camera app, and zoomed in. There she was, Margaret, armed with a pair of gardening gloves and a flashlight, trying to rip out his cacti. Ethan shook his head, both amused and annoyed. He tapped the microphone button on his security camera and spoke through the built-in speaker. "Nice night for some trespassing, huh, Margaret?" Margaret screamed, dropping the cactus she had been wrestling with. She whirled around, eyes wide, her flashlight fumbling in her hands. I was just... Ethan grinned. "Stealing my plants? Damaging my property?" "Both." Margaret scrambled to her feet, waving a dismissive hand. "I was, trying to make the neighborhood look better. These cacti are dangerous." Ethan laughed. "Oh, sure. Because tearing them out with your bare hands is the safest way to go about it." Margaret huffed, shoving her flashlight into her pocket. "You can't prove I was." Ethan tapped his phone screen. "Smile for the camera, Margaret. You're live on 3 different security feeds." Margaret paled, glancing around as if suddenly realizing that, yes, security cameras do exist. Without another word, she turned and bolted toward her house, nearly tripping over her own feet in the process. The next morning, Ethan sent the footage to Mr. Grayson at the HOA, along with a simple message. "I believe we need to discuss safety concerns regarding trespassers." The response came quickly. Mr. Grayson requested a meeting with Margaret to address the matter. That afternoon, Ethan watched with unfiltered joy as Margaret was called into the HOA office. The look on her face was priceless. She had been so focused on removing his plants that she hadn't realized she was digging her own grave. When she returned, she didn't so much as glance in Ethan's direction. Instead, she stomped into her house, slamming the door so hard that a nearby wind chime fell off its hook. Ethan smiled to himself. The battle had taken an interesting turn. Margaret had gone from an overconfident menace to a desperate trespasser in just a matter of days. But something told him she still wasn't done. She had lost this round. But the war wasn't over yet. Ethan knew Margaret wouldn't go down without a fight. She had been humiliated, caught red-handed trespassing on his property, and exposed to the very HOA she had tried to weaponize against him. But instead of learning her lesson and backing off, Margaret did what she always did. She doubled down. The very next morning, Ethan spotted her in front of her house, huddled with a small group of neighbors. He recognized a few of them as HOA loyalists. The kind of people who enforced rules with clipboard enthusiasm and took great pleasure in measuring the length of grass blades. Margaret was gesturing wildly toward his yard, her voice rising with a mix of frustration and fake concern. Ethan didn't need to hear what she was saying to know her plan. She was rallying her troops. Sure enough, within the hour, Mr. Grayson arrived again, this time flanked by 2 other HOA board members. Ethan sighed, putting down his gardening gloves and strolling over to meet them at the edge of his property. Mr. Grayson cleared his throat, his expression unreadable. Ethan, the board has reviewed the latest complaint. Ethan folded his arms. Let me guess. Margaret is now claiming my garden is a public nuisance. One of the board members, a woman named Mrs. Whitaker, nodded. There have been multiple complaints about the cacti being a danger to pedestrians. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Pedestrians? The only person walking through here is Margaret. And last I checked, trespassing doesn't make you a pedestrian. It makes you a problem. Mr. Grayson sighed, clearly tired of being in the middle of this mess. Regardless, the HOA has to take neighborhood concerns seriously. Ethan held up his phone. You mean concerns like trespassing? Because I have video evidence of Margaret entering my property in the middle of the night and attempting to vandalize my garden. I'm more than happy to take this to an attorney. That made Grayson pause. The other 2 board members exchanged glances. Ethan knew they weren't expecting him to fight back with hard evidence. HOA rules were one thing, but legal battles? That was another. Mrs. Whitaker shifted uncomfortably. Ethan, we understand your frustration, but... A new voice interrupted. Actually, I think Ethan has a very strong case. Everyone turned to see Mr. Harrison, the retired lawyer from down the street, strolling up with his hands in his pockets. He was wearing his usual sun hat, his expression casual but sharp. Ethan hid his smile. He hadn't expected backup, but if anyone could shut down HOA nonsense, it was Mr. Harrison. Mr. Harrison gestured toward the board members. Now, I've been living here long enough to know the HOA rules inside and out. And I recall a very specific clause about repeated trespassing, something about a homeowner's right to protect their property. Mrs. Whitaker's face tightened. That's not. Oh, but it is, Mr. Harrison interrupted smoothly. See, if someone is repeatedly caught violating property boundaries, they forfeit their right to file HOA complaints about that same property. Keeps people from abusing the system to harass their neighbors. Ethan blinked. He had been looking through the rulebook for loopholes, but somehow he had missed this particular gem. Mr. Harrison just smirked, clearly enjoying the moment. Mr. Grayson frowned. That is technically true. Margaret, who had been watching the exchange from her porch, stormed over in outrage. You can't be serious. He planted dangerous plants on purpose. Mr. Harrison shrugged. On his own property, which he has every right to do. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a malfunctioning ventriloquist dummy. Ethan finally spoke up, his voice as calm as ever. If I set a trap, Margaret, then I guess my entire yard is a trap. Maybe the sidewalk is a trap too. Maybe trees are traps. Should I get rid of my mailbox because you might stub your toe on it? Margaret's face turned an alarming shade of red. This is harassment. Mr. Grayson pinched the bridge of his nose, clearly regretting every life choice that had led him to this moment. Margaret, based on the evidence provided, I don't believe we can enforce any action against Ethan. Margaret gasped. But what about my foot? I was injured. Ethan smirked. And whose fault is that? Margaret glared at him, but her usual bravado was fading. The board members weren't backing her up, and she knew it. She was running out of options. Mrs. Whitaker, who had looked ready to argue moments ago, now seemed eager to wrap up the conversation. Ethan's cactus garden is compliant with HOA landscaping regulations. If there are no further violations, I think we should consider this matter closed. Ethan could practically see the defeat settle into Margaret's shoulders. She had lost. Margaret huffed, spinning on her heel and stomping back toward her house. Unfortunately for her, she had forgotten about the single loose cactus pad that had fallen off during her late-night trespassing attempt. Her foot landed directly on it. The scream that followed was glorious. Ethan watched as she hopped on one foot, yanking out tiny spines while cursing under her breath. A few neighbors chuckled from their driveways. Even Mr. Grayson struggled to keep a straight face. Margaret finally yanked off her shoe, threw it at her porch in frustration, and disappeared inside her house. Mr. Harrison clapped Ethan on the back. "Well, that was fun." Ethan grinned. "That was the highlight of my week." As the board members awkwardly excused themselves, Ethan leaned against his porch railing, watching the street return to normal. For the first time in weeks, he felt a real sense of victory. The next morning, he stepped outside to water his plants, half expecting Margaret to make some last-ditch effort to retaliate. But instead, he saw something even better. Margaret was walking on the sidewalk, for the first time ever. Ethan smiled to himself. Nature always found a way. In the weeks that followed, Ethan's garden flourished. The cacti stood tall and proud, their spines glistening in the sunlight. The agave plants and desert roses added a touch of elegance, and the decorative gravel gave the yard a polished, finished look. Ethan had turned his garden into a desert oasis, a testament to his determination and creativity. Margaret, on the other hand, had learned her lesson, sort of. She still scowled at Ethan whenever she passed by, but she no longer dared to set foot in his yard. The sidewalk had become her new path, and while she grumbled about it, she knew better than to challenge Ethan again. As for Ethan, he had gained more than just a beautiful garden. He had gained the respect of his neighbors, who admired his ingenuity and courage in standing up to Margaret. Even Mr. Grayson, the HOA representative, had to admit that Ethan's garden was a welcome addition to the neighborhood. And so, the battle of the garden came to an end. Ethan had emerged victorious, not just over Margaret, but over the petty rules and regulations that had tried to stifle his creativity. He had proven that sometimes the best way to win a war is to outsmart your opponent, and maybe plant a few cacti along the way. As he stood on his porch, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over his desert oasis, Ethan couldn't help but smile. Life was good, and his garden? It was perfect. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.